Hi, everybody. It's 4, so we're going to begin. If you've been to a street law webinar or professional development before, you know we are very committed to starting and ending on time. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining us for our little information session here today, introducing Street Law's new Legal Timelines website. We are really super excited and proud of this resource. And spoiler alert for the end, we're gonna add some more timelines. So we're also always very eager to get user input. So we're happy to show you what we have now, and we're also always willing to listen to suggestions from you all. So planting that seed early so you can think of that as we walk you through this for the sort of, I wish it could do this thing. Okay, we're going to start with just an overview of the site. So in case you've never visited, you can see what is available to there. And then we're going to get into some more nitty gritty about exactly what resources are there and how to navigate it, and maybe some pro tips too from Jen about how to use the timeline in the best way. So we created this site because we saw a need for there to be sort of a through line through history of the development of some really important legal issues. And we wanted students to be able to see those connections between these events. So instead of just seeing cases or laws in isolation, they could see how they fit together in sort of the ebb and flow of those issues throughout history. And we did that through, this full project is through a grant with the Library of Congress Teaching Primary Sources project, which you'll hear lots about today. And so we based that in the inquiry method and specifically documents that are available mostly in the Library of Congress resources. So it's a marriage of those things, these primary sources that tell us a lot about specific events or times in history of these legal concepts, and then that through line where you can see the evolution and the change over time. Right now we have 3 timelines on the website. We have federalism, a legal timeline of the division of power. We have safeguards of justice, a legal timeline of the rights of the accused, and we have suffrage, a legal timeline of voting rights. These subjects came from a survey that we did of teachers, asking them which subjects that they needed materials for. So we're interested in all of those topics, but we didn't focus on them just because that's where our areas of interest lie. We went out and found out from teachers where they needed more resources, and specifically these kinds of resources. So for each of those timelines, there are 5 or 6 inquiry packs, and those inquiry packs could be standalone if you wanted them to be, but they're also made to work within the timeline, and they each have several primary source documents. And then the students are asked to read a background reading, so it puts them in context, and then delve into each document in more detail. And all of that to work towards the answer of an inquiry question. There will be an overarching question. We're going to talk a lot more about the inquiry packs later, but just to, if that's a new term for you or a new concept, that's what we mean when we talk about inquiry packs. So who are these timelines made for? We're going for upper elementary, grade 6 through high school, on-level classes and advanced classes. And the timeline can really be accessed by teachers and students. And that was really important to us. So one of the first things we had to decide is this a teacher timeline where teachers go to get resources to, for instance, copy and hand out to students? Or is this a place where students go directly, or do we try to make it a website that is friendly to both? And we went for the last one. So it's a great place for teachers to go if you're looking for some background information for yourself, or if you're looking for a specific, very focused area that you're looking for resources for. Like, for instance, we have a packet about suffrage and Reconstruction. But also it's a good place to send students. If you're studying a concept and you want to give them an overview of that concept, it's a good place to send students so that they can interact with the interactive functions of the timeline, and maybe find the inquiries that appeal most to them. So it's really meant for both teachers and students. For that reason, there's no login, and you don't have to go to our store to access materials, so that students are able to just have immediate access to the materials. And Jen will talk more about that when she walks you through it. The inquiry packs, however, I don't mean to imply that every inquiry pack maybe is a great fit for a grade 6. So the inquiry packs are really not one size fits all. Some of them are a little more in depth, maybe assumed a lot more background knowledge from the student. And so when you go to choose these for your classes, you're going to want to look at them and vet them and choose thoughtfully based on your level of students and your level of class. Whether that's, does it fit a history class or a civics class? Although certainly there are many that would work well in both. Or is this something that's accessible to a 6th grader? Or maybe this is an activity for an AP class. So the ones that I'm really thinking about there, in the federalism timeline, there is a pack on incorporation and there's one on devolution. These likely are not topics that you're bringing up with your middle school students, although it's not without possibility, but it's probably not in your standards. You're probably not attacking incorporation and devolution. And even within the inquiry packs, and you'll see this when we look at them a little more closely later, there's a lot of flexibility. So you might choose to focus on the inquiry packs that are more about history topics that are more based in the past, or ones that are more focused on the current conditions. And then even within those inquiry packs, there are several documents and an inquiry question. You might choose to present your students with the question in all the documents, or you might just want to cherry pick a couple documents that you think really hit at the standards you're trying to achieve, or would be really high interest to your students. So there's a lot of flexibility there, and we have them in a format that makes it easy to do so. And I'm going to turn it over to Jen for site navigation.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. So I'm going to sort of walk us through several parts of the timeline. This is what I'll be sharing with you, is just a general site overview, how to access and navigate the timelines in particular. There are a couple of tools that are a little less visible, but very helpful, and I wanted to point those out. Share with you the accessible timelines and how there's sort of an alternate way to view the timelines. We have a glossary, and I want to share a few different ways that you can access the glossary, and also how you can access the inquiry packs, though Kathy will go into more depth with those inquiry packs. So we're going to switch screen shares for a moment. I'm going to share my screen. You see it? Cool. Okay. So this is the main page when you go to legaltimelines.org. We kept it pretty simple. There's a few icons or buttons at the top of the screen, the about and the contact. I'm not even going to click. They're pretty self-explanatory. The timelines you can access through this drop-down menu. You can see all 3 timelines plus a link to the accessible timelines, or you can scroll down and access the timelines this way. If you go to the bottom, you'll see some of the links again, and you'll see links to some street law and teaching with primary sources sites. So I want to go into the timelines, and we'll look at 2 of these timelines just to show some specific features on those timelines. Let's start with the federalism one. And when you first pull it up, you'll notice the top bar doesn't change. You can still navigate using the top bar. We've got the title and a little bit more detail about what this timeline is all about. Then you've got the timeline itself. the learning activities are the inquiry pack. So I'll share more about those in a moment, but let's look at the timeline specifically. So there's a couple ways to navigate the timeline. You've got buttons on the left and the right that will just advance the timeline up one, back one, and so forth. But you've also got a timeline here that you can drag. So I'm clicking my mouse and dragging this across, and you can see that the entries are really far apart initially from one another, but then we get a bunch of entries all at once. That also has to do with the scale that I'm looking at here on the timeline. If you want to change the scale, if you want to see these entries separated a bit more, you can zoom in. So we've got 3 buttons over here on the left. And if I click the zoom in button, it's going to take me back to the beginning, but it will also let me zoom in a bit more so that I can, probably be easier if I did this, so that I can see those entries farther apart now. I'm going to zoom back out. So you can also zoom way out so that you see everything all in one. And there's almost everything all in one. That one is really early on there. You'll also see in this timeline, we've got these different categories. These are different eras of federalism, and the entries have lined up with those eras, so that pre-federalism, we've got a couple entries here. Dual federalism 1, we've got several entries, and so on. And as you can probably guess with eras, the eras gradually happen. They don't sort of go back in time. So some of the time, 2 of the timelines are sort of set up to have these categories as well. So I'm going to take a look also at the Safeguards of Justice timeline, because it does a similar thing. This time, our categories are related to multiple amendments and then specific to certain amendments. And just like before, you can navigate the timeline. We've got the Magna Carta early on, but this one jumps around a bit more because it's not related to a certain time. So we've got one of our first entries is 4th Amendment related, and then we've got an entry, the first recorded execution in the colonies is in 1608. Now, when you actually use the timeline, when you click on these entries or when you advance the entry, you're going to see the date. Sometimes there's an exact date, sometimes it's a range of dates. You've got sort of the title of the entry, and then you've got a few sentences that are an overview of what that entry is all about. You have a source. The source will take you out to that actual source. So if your students want to do more in-depth research, they want to read more about that entry in particular, they can go there. Many of the entries also have some sort of media with them. And there's a caption here with this media. You can see, if you look at the timeline, you can see where the media is. It's probably really small on your screen, but if you pull it up on your own screen, there's a little icon next to the English Bill of Rights, and that indicates that this is the media that we're looking at. But when I go back to this entry, there's no icon next to it, so there's no media next to it. And some of the icons have a little video play button next to them because there's an embedded video in there for students to take a look at. You'll also notice in the entries that if there is an inquiry pack that's related to that entry, it's linked in here so that you can go directly to that inquiry pack. And then the last thing I wanted to show was that the glossary terms will be bolded and underlined in the entries. And if you click on them, it will open up a new window and take you directly to the definition of that term at the top of the page. So students hopefully have the information they need to be able to comprehend and even go a little bit deeper if they want on the different entries that are there. So next I want to show you the accessible timelines. I'm going to access the accessible timelines by dropping down the menu here. The accessible timelines are going to look a little bit different. They're not going to be interactive. And we wanted to make sure that accessible timelines existed for a few different reasons. Number one, screen readers should be able to read these accessible timelines in a way that they probably won't be able to read those timelines, the interactive timelines that I just displayed. So once you go down, and this is sort of a menu, or table of contents. So I click on it and it'll take me to that entry. The entry's got the same information as before. It's still got the media, it's got the vocabulary term, the sources. I can click this to take me back to the top, but it now has it all in one page. If you wanted to use up a lot of paper and print this, you definitely could as well. The other way that I think the accessible timelines are really effective is if you want to search a timeline. So if I want to find a timeline that specifically talks about amendments, I can search the word amendment and I've got 30 hits here. So, maybe not the most effective search that just happened, but I also knew that I'd get plenty of hits when I put that in. So, if students are looking for something in particular, maybe the accessible timeline with a little Control F might be useful for them. Before I go on, I think it's important to share that sometimes we view students as digital natives, right? I think that some of these things may need to actually be modeled or pointed out to students. I honestly didn't realize the zoom in, zoom out feature on those timelines until pretty recently. They're kind of small, right? And so if you want to, if you're able to pull up a screen for 5 minutes and share with students how it can be navigated, that will probably save you a lot of headaches later on if you ask them to access these timelines independently. So I showed earlier how to access the glossary when a term was in an entry, but you can also look at the whole glossary up here. It's going to go in alphabetical order. So, and it's pretty long. As we add more timelines, it will only get longer. So if you are going to access it up here, you might just want to prepare that Control F again. And then finally, the inquiry packs. In order to access them, you have to go into the timelines because they're organized by timeline. They're deeper dives into the information in the timeline. But I can either click on this button or I can just scroll down. It takes me to the same place. And I can click on the inquiry pack and it'll pull it up for me as a PDF. If you also want to download the inquiry packs in a different way, our lesson library has them on our site for free as well. So now I'll turn it back over to Kathy. I think I hit the highs of this, and Kathy will talk a bit more about the inquiry packs and go through them.
There we go. I was muted. Okay, so the inquiry packs, I wanted to say that they exist both in the timeline and also in our free resource library of the Street Law website. I think of the two, it's probably easier to access them through Legal Timelines, but if you are looking for them, you can find them there as well. So these, as I said before, are built mostly around primary sources from the Library of Congress. So there are times when we couldn't find exactly what we were looking for, and we maybe took something from archives or something like that. But a huge percentage of the documents are from the Library of Congress digital collection. And if you've used that before, you know that it is really expansive and robust. It's also sometimes not the most user-friendly resource. So I think it's helpful to have them pulled for you and extracted for you so that they're sort of already, you have a category of them that help to get to this one concept. So they are designed to accompany the timeline. So the timelines came first and the packs out of them. So they try to take some theme in the timeline and really focus in on it so that the students can see how those events on the timeline also fit together to help answer an inquiry question. Each pack has several things. They're formulaic. They all follow the same formula. They all have a background reading. We tried to keep it to 2 pages. Every once in a while, we weren't able to do that. When there is vocabulary that is difficult, it's defined within the text, or if there's language within a document, we make sure to define it. So if you're working within that 6 to 12, 6th grade to 12th grade area, likely there won't have to be too much scaffolding of vocabulary. Maybe a little bit for middle school, or if you're working with English language learners. And then there are several primary sources. The numbers vary, but somewhere usually between 5 and 8. They are all sorts of documents, legal documents, or articles from Chronicling America, which is historic newspapers. Sometimes images. We tried to use images as much as we could because we know kids like to engage with images. All sorts of things that we tried to mix up the media as much as we could. Some inquiry packs are understandably maybe a little more text heavy. I'm thinking of one under federalism, about federalism and the Constitution, where almost every document is just a part of the Constitution. So not a lot of great imagery there, but when we could, we tried to supply a variety to keep the students engaged. There are also discussion questions for each document, and then an inquiry question that goes over all of the documents. And you can see here, this was a great suggestion from our pilot teachers, that at the top of that inquiry pack about technology and the Fourth Amendment, you can see the inquiry question in yellow, so that students, if you handed them the packet or gave it to them virtually, at the very top would see, this is why I'm looking at these documents. I'm working towards this inquiry question. And if your screen's small, you may or may not be able to read it. So I'll read this one for you. For this packet is, how have advances in technology changed the way the search and seizure clause of the Fourth Amendment has been interpreted? So they know when they interact with those different documents, that's the overarching question that they're looking at. We also have an inquiry extension question that takes things a little bit deeper. So that's if you're really going to focus on this, or maybe if you have advanced classes, or if you're teaching a course, like for instance, in a government class, you're probably not going to go any deeper than that, but maybe in a law class you would. So these are the lists of the inquiry packs. You could also access them the way Jen did, which is that you pull up the timeline and then you scroll down. But I just wanted to put each one up on the screen for a moment so you could get a sense of the types of inquiry packs available for each month. As I mentioned before, for federalism, the devolution and incorporation doctrine ones are fairly, complicated, and maybe not for middle school. For safeguards of justice, rights of the accused, we have balancing the rights of the accused and public safety, so sort of an overarching one. And then getting into some amendments, capital punishment in the 8th Amendment, technology in the 4th Amendment, a focus on a historical trial, the Scottsboro trial, and then the evolution of the juvenile justice system. And for suffrage, who should be able to vote, voting requirements, the right to vote for all the residents of the District of Columbia, the right to make the rules, again, federalism, so that maybe is a crossover one. Who gets to make the rules about elections? That's certainly a topic that is ripped from the headlines, considering yesterday's argument of Moore v. Harper. I'm gonna take you through a little bit look at a little closer the missing right and explicit right to vote. I think that one's really interesting. And then women's suffrage and Reconstruction and suffrage. This is the timeline that has 6 packs instead of just 5. So I wanted to talk about the primary sources for just a moment. We tried to pick the primary sources in a way that was engaging and also sort of got to the heart of what we were the point that we were trying to have students consider when they looked at the inquiry question. So we tried to make sure that when there were text excerpts, that they were focused as much as we could. So I'll show you some examples on the next slide, but not to put in pages of an excerpt, but to really try to get at the heart of why we thought that document was important. Because of that, though, we also made sure that there are links to the documents so that if you don't want to have your students focus immediately on the right answer, if you maybe want them to pore over the document, a larger excerpt from the document or the whole document, and try to find themselves what is the core of this document, that you would be able to do that too. So perhaps in an advanced class, you don't want to go to the 1 or 2 sentence in a majority opinion that says this is what we decided. You want them to look at a larger part of the document and come to their own conclusion about what the decision was. So we wanted to make sure you had the option to send students out to those, or for you yourself to go find a larger excerpt, either one. And for each document, there are discussion questions. And if you've been trained by the Library of Congress Teaching with Primary Sources project, or if you've seen any of their materials, you'll recognize these as the Library of Congress tools that they like to use. So every document will have different questions, but they will all have these 3 types of questions. Observed questions. Very often it's just sort of, what do you see? So given this image that we're looking at, what do you notice about the image? What strikes you first about the image? A reflection question that sort of gets more at the content of whatever the document is. And then the last one is, what questions do you still have about that document? So, that is a big part of the inquiry method, is not only do you ask questions and ask students to answer them, but you prompt students to create their own questions about documents and what they might mean. So there is one document right there from one of the suffrage timelines. And I just wanted to highlight a couple more before I take you to one. This is a good example of us trying to focus the documents. So the excerpts on the sort of heart of the document. So this is in the explicit right to vote inquiry pack that I'm going to show you on the website in a second. So you'll see all of the documents. But this is getting at the Supreme Court's conflicting views about whether or not there is an explicit right to vote in the Constitution. And we really focused in on just a few sentences from the majority opinion in Westbury versus Sanders, and then 35 years later in part of the opinion for Bush v. Gore, so that students could compare. Both of these are coming from the court. Supposedly both are the ultimate interpretation of the Constitution, but the fact that there are conflicting views there. And again, if you would want to, in the endnotes, there are links to both of these larger documents, and you could send students out to read the text around these very focused excerpts. A couple other documents that I just wanted to highlight because I think they're really super cool, and I think that your students would love engaging with them, and are indicative of the kinds of documents that we tried to find. So this is something that probably a lot of you have seen, but maybe your students haven't. This is the Chief Justice Earl Warren's copy of the decision in Brown v. Board of Education. It's the one that he used when he handed down the decision from the bench. And so not only can students read what the decision was in that case, which is, what's going to be on the AP test and what's going to be on any standardized test and probably what's going to be on your final, but for them to also see that he wrote in the word unanimously in his own handwriting, and that he underlined the things that he thought were really important and the places that he wanted to give emphasis as he voiced this opinion, I think really brings it to life. It also might be important to them that the official opinion still does not have the word unanimously in there. And then I also wanted you to see in this document that we have the kinds of source information we give students. We don't expect them to be familiar with the decision in Brown. And so we make sure that there's some background when we give these documents in the source information to put the document in context. So it tells them that, you know, the decision was for Brown. And then it also sometimes has a little bit more human interest kind of information, or again, sort of just the flavor of the document. For instance, in this one, it talks about the fact that the Chief Justice wrote that as he said the word unanimously, that there was a wave of emotion that went through the courtroom. So that's the kind of document that takes something that could be just a boring, you know, this is what Brown won, it was 9-0, and really sort of gives some color to that event. This is a really amazing document that Jen found. I can't take any credit for this, but this is one from the Safeguards of Justice death penalty packet. And I'll just let you read it for a second so that you can read it. And of course, we had to rewrite it, type it, because many students now don't read cursive. So so there's a transcript, even though the original is probably pretty easy to read for you. So it's short. I'm going to assume that that was enough time, but if not, feel free to keep reading. So this is a great document that doesn't just tell students what events happen, but also helps them to understand the reaction to some of the events, the multiple perspectives that people had on certain events. And it also shows you a little bit of a glossary of the terms when we feel like there are terms that come up in these documents. Because this isn't interactive, it's a piece of paper, we define them right there so that students, hopefully, you know, the things that we don't think they can figure out from context clues, they don't have to have a dictionary right next to them. And Jen got some interesting feedback from a pilot teacher that I'm going to ask her to come off mute and share with us.
Yeah, just the students were really liked this inquiry pack, but when they got to this source in particular, it sort of caused a lot of commotion in a positive way in the classroom, that they were especially interested in who this person is and what she was reacting to. So, you know, something even this short can cause a lot of discussion.
Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to change my share, hopefully successfully, to go to the missing right, the explicit right to vote packet, so that you can see what a packet looks like all together. So again, it's always going to start with the inquiry question highlighted in yellow, so hopefully students can't miss it. This one is, should the Constitution be amended to guarantee an explicit right to vote? So that's what they're going to take a look at. And you can just see through this packet how the inquiry packet sort of build. So first of all, it starts with an introduction. In this case, it starts with a quote, and then it gives students a background. Again, we don't expect them to know the contents of the 14th, 15th, 19th, and 26th Amendment. We're going to tell them about that. So if you haven't already studied the foundations of suffrage, they should be able to get what they need from the background reading. And then we start with the documents. In this case, the first one isn't one singular document. It's a bunch of quotes from different founders about their conflicting views. So one of the things that we hoped to achieve with the timeline and the inquiry packs are multiple perspectives. So this is a great example of that. The founders weren't one person. They represented lots of different constituents. They had lots of different views on whether there should be an explicit right to vote. Also, again, just to show you in the source information, we're also not going to assume that they know who John Adams, Ben Franklin, Thomas Paine, and James Madison are. Maybe they do, but if they don't, it's going to give them some background so they understand who the speakers are and why what they're saying is important and why they might have multiple perspectives. Then you can see those questions. I'm not going to pause on these every time, but these are the kind of questions, the format of the questions for every document, the observe, reflect, and question format from the Library of Congress, Teaching with Primary Sources. The second document is a visual. It is the cover of Harper's Weekly. And again, a little background about, when this publication happened, a little context for students. A political cartoon. I know that a lot of people have in their standards that they need to be able to interpret political cartoons. And so this is a pretty famous one about the 14th Amendment and Reconstruction. This is the document we looked at before with the excerpts to show that, if you're having trouble deciding if there is an explicit right to vote, you're not alone. So does the Supreme Court. And finally, a proposed amendment, a fairly recent one, 2017, an amendment that says that every citizen of the United States who is of legal voting age shall have the fundamental right to vote in any public election held in the jurisdiction in which the citizen resides. So this is the document they need to think about in the inquiry question, which is, should the Constitution be amended to guarantee that explicit right to vote? So this is fairly typical. There's the extension question. So this one is explain to look at state laws that restrict voting and see if this amendment was passed, would those state laws still pass muster, or might they violate that amendment? And here's what I was talking about with the endnotes and the links to the documents, so that students can, if you want to send your students out to the larger documents, if you think the excerpts are too focused, that it makes it really easy to do that. And the last thing I want to show you, I have a slide, but it's actually better to show you not in a slide, is that some other feedback we got from pilot teachers was that it would be helpful to have a graphic organizer for students to use to help them organize the information that they got to try to build towards an answer to the inquiry question. So we made this fillable PDF where the students can, write in the inquiry question, and then for each source, they can think, what evidence do I get out of that source that helps me answer the inquiry question? And then when they get to the end, we don't have any that have more than 8 documents. So there might be more spaces than are necessary for some of the packs, but there's at least enough for the largest pack. And then that way, when they go to answer the inquiry question, they have that information already gathered in this graphic organizer. We thought that was a fantastic suggestion from our pilot teachers. Okay, I'm going to go back. Okay, I'm going to throw it back to you, Jen, for instructional uses.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. So I wanted to share just a little bit of the feedback that we got from teachers. We had about 45, maybe 50 teachers using a variety of these resources at this time last year, getting their feedback both about the resources themselves, but also how they use the resources. And before we get too deep into that, just as sort of a reminder, you've heard some of these things already, but the website really is designed to be more student oriented. We will, though, add at some point this school year, a new probably header button that is specifically for teachers and offers some different ideas on how you can use the resources. But as Kathy mentioned before, these resources are meant to be really flexible. So if you go to the next slide, we'll see sort of some of the examples of ways that teachers have used these resources. Oh, what happened to that top one? There it is. I don't think there's I guess there is an animation on it. Okay. So these 3 sort of paths are 3 different paths that different teachers took. These 3 paths in using these materials are 3 of probably hundreds of different ways you could use these materials, and they're certainly not limited to these ways. So for example, we had some teachers that assigned the intro reading for homework. And then the next day when students came in after sort of debriefing that intro reading, they set up a gallery walk with the different sources. Students would go through the gallery walk and analyze and learn collaboratively with those resources. And then they'd have a discussion on the inquiry question. So they wouldn't necessarily ask their students to write something on the question, they just talk about it. Another teacher had a great idea to do sort of a timeline scavenger hunt to introduce students to the particular topic that they were getting into. So they had time on their computers to do that scavenger hunt. Then, and I believe this is a middle school teacher, then they did a read aloud of the intro reading and sort of stopped as they read and checked in for understanding, predefined vocabulary, did all those things that good reading teachers do. And that's the type of thing that this teacher pre-read the reading and said, here's the additional scaffolds that I'm going to need to include in order to make this reading work for my students. So that's just, Kathy mentioned before, you definitely want to go through these resources and consider what teacher moves you need to make. It's pretty rare, though not out of the question, that you can just hand a packet to students and say, go, and they can do everything exactly the way that you're expecting them to. After that, the teacher paired them up so that they were looking at sources in small groups and sharing those sources together, and then had them do the inquiry question as an essay. And then we've got a last group. I believe that this was an AP teacher who taught on maybe like a semester schedule and just really felt like, I need to get this, 45 minutes. I like this inquiry pack, but can't spend a full class period on it. Cut the intro reading down to just the pieces that they thought the students needed to know. So they recognize that students have background knowledge about these things in the intro reading. I only need them to learn about these 2 additional paragraphs. They picked 3 of the several sources that they thought would be most relevant, and then they just didn't do the inquiry question, and that's totally fine. If you were to scour through all of these materials and decide that you only like one of the sources, that's okay. We've sort of set these up, and we set a lot of materials up at Street Law in a way that is designed to be flexible. We have different classes, we have different teaching styles, and so however you want to use these materials to make it best work for your students is absolutely a way that you can use them. So I wanted to go a little bit more into depth about some additional tips and ideas from pilot teachers. I think that purposeful selection is something that I just talked about before, that we're not blindly saying, all right, this seems like a good inquiry pack. I don't need to look through it. I'm just going to give it to my students. But we're looking at the inquiry pack and we're thinking about, do I need each of these documents? Do I have time for each of these documents? What's going to be the best way that I put these materials together in order for my students to understand and to make good use of our time? I think modeling is really key. Modeling is just really key in our lives, in our teacher lives. So modeling how to examine the sources, modeling how you compare sources to one another, because a lot of those sources are meant to be combined with one another. Modeling how sources can be used to answer the question, not assuming that students know how to sort of combine in a written answer, using evidence from this source and evidence from this source. And then modeling connecting the sources to the timeline. That leads into the next one. These timelines were created based on feedback from a project that we did a few years ago. In that project, we were only creating inquiry packs, and several teachers said, the inquiry packs are great, but I need something that gives a broader contextual view of what's happening at that time period before we can dig into the inquiry pack. So those timelines are meant to provide some context for things. So if you can combine the timeline with some of this information, hopefully that will work. The next 2 bullets are sort of some suggestions for how to use the resources in the class. I had one teacher, I forget which one they used it for, but they created a deliberation or structured academic controversy out of the inquiry pack and had students use the sources as sort of their text evidence. Some teachers, as they've done several of these, have decided, well, this fits sort of our assessment style. And so I'm going to assign this packet as an assessment. The inquiry question will be an essay they turn in for a grade. And then the last one, I think, is a really interesting idea that a teacher had, which is having students look at the collection of sources, look at the inquiry question, and then ask them to do a little research and say, hey, find one more source that you think adds to the story of this inquiry question. And you'll actually see something like that as an activity in the extension question on the Reconstruction inquiry pack and the voting rights timeline. So there's sort of a model there if you want to take a look at that. So at this point, we'll open it up for any questions that folks have.
I answered a few in the Q&A. While we're waiting for maybe some people to formulate questions, I'll say that one of the ones I answered in the Q&A was, will you be developing an inquiry pack about the independent state legislature theory? So if that question baffles you, if it doesn't sound familiar to you, that is the theory that was in question in yesterday's Moore v. Harper oral arguments. And so my answer to that question was a little on the fence, but if the court would find that it holds, that would be a big deal, and it would make that case a landmark case, and we might think about it. Otherwise, it's not completely likely, as that if they don't, it probably has a shelf life as a topic, and we're really trying to pick things that are going to be in standards. People are really going to a lot of people are going to teach. They're going to reach a lot of classrooms. But I love that question, and whoever asked it, anonymous attendee, you get bonus points for that question. Okay, a question just came in. So the question that just came in was, are we thinking of developing a timeline on privacy or women's rights abortion? I'll tell you in a minute about the two that are in progress. And I guess we can answer how we chose them. So one of the things we did consider are things that are in a lot of standards, and then things that teachers are telling us they need resources for. So we do have a fair amount of case summaries on our in our website about the women's rights, about the cases that are there, even up through Dobbs. But I doubt that we would make a whole timeline on it. Also, as just sort of how the sausage gets made kind of information, we do have to work with what is available in the Library of Congress digital library, and they tend to have a lot more for things that are not current. So it gets more and more challenging for Jen and I as events are getting closer and closer in time to now, to find documents on the Library of Congress website. So just as a real practical restraint on the topics that we choose, we have to choose topics that have a lot of historical presence, so that we can find actual documents.
Yeah. Kathy, do you want to talk briefly about the the Roe case on landmark cases?
Landmark cases. Yeah, so some of you may or may not know that Street Law also, we are the content providers for landmarkcases.org, and we just really fairly recently updated all of the cases on landmark cases just in time for Roe to be overturned. So we will shortly begin a process of updating the Roe v. Wade resources, but already available on there is like I said, in our resource library is a case summary on Dobbs that could help you bring those materials to present. But there is a lot of information on landmark cases about that if you're teaching about privacy and women's rights reproductive rights, that would be a great place to find resources. Any other questions? Okay, well, we'll go on, but you can always drop questions in the chat. And we will certainly make sure that we come back to them. Okay, so I just mentioned the fact that there are two timelines in development. Those timelines are students' rights and powers of the president. So these were answers to the survey that we gave out to teachers about what are your students interested, what legal timelines might you use. They also have a good span of cases. For the students' rights one, I've already finished drafting the timeline for that, and it is out for expert legal review. That one's great because it can help you also tie to your standards with the Bill of Rights, because it's, what are students' First Amendment rights? What are their rights to free exercise? What are their rights to free speech? What is their right to free assembly? And then, what are their Fourth Amendment rights? There are even cases on there about their Eighth Amendment rights, because there are some cases about corporal punishment. And then there are also rights that would tie to things like Brown v. Board of Education and those and the cases about students' right to an education. So that's one that a lot of teachers were asking for. And then the powers of the president is a great one. With there was the Supreme Court just recently decided to grant cert in a case about whether President Biden can excuse student debt, right? So that's something that's going to be in the courts in February about the powers of the president. Does he have the power to do that? So those are the two that we're working on right now. We did, while we have an interested audience, people who are willing to give up their evening to spend time finding out about landmark cases, or not landmark cases, legal timelines. They sound so much alike. We did want to plant a seed with you all that we will be shortly looking for a new pilot cohort to pilot these two timelines. And we're really looking for people who did not participate in the first pilot. So I don't know if any of you are on here, but we're looking for new people with a fresh perspective. And what we would ask those teachers to do is to use the timeline and use some of the inquiry packs in their classrooms and just give us feedback. It's really important to us that that we hear from teachers in the classroom about materials. And you can tell from what we've said tonight that we take that very seriously, and we really do change the materials and add and subtract. We didn't talk too much about the things we subtracted, but we sure did. Based on what teachers are telling us is working and isn't working in their classroom. So, and there were many more times when we could have said it. It made it into the presentation several times, but we can attribute a lot of the improvements to the site to our pilot for sure.
Yeah.
Jen, you look like you.
Yeah, just a quick overview of what the likely timeline for the pilot cohort is going to be. I think we'll probably open up the application at the very beginning of January. After that, you'll have a month to apply. It won't be a very rigorous application. It's just going to be sort of a form, answer some questions. You don't need to get anybody's reference or anything like that. And then we'd be looking to do sort of professional development workshop toward the end of February or beginning of March. And then you'd have the rest of the school year to try to use the resources. If you are considering signing up for the pilot, the two timelines and related resources that you see on the screen are what we'll be working with. So if you don't think that you could integrate them into your classes, then it's going to be a hard thing for you to make the pilot work for you. But if you do think so, then definitely sign up for our newsletter and keep on the lookout for when the application is open.
And we do provide stipends for teachers. So it is a token. It in no way, shape, or form could compensate you for the actual value of your time. But we do want teachers to know that we really appreciate when they take the time to do these things. And we do want to honor the fact that your the contributions that you make, the feedback that you give us is really important, and that we value it. Oh, wait, I didn't want to jump over that slide. Because we know we probably have some super fans in the audience that sort of show up for all things street law, and someone just put in the chat that they love our materials. So if you use our materials, we're really looking for our 2023 classroom champion right now. And we are looking for someone, maybe you've never even attended a street law PD, maybe this is the first time you've ever interacted with us in this webinar, but if you're using our materials and you're reaching your students with them, that's really, and moving our mission to, of law and civics related education forward, we want to hear from you. And we were just at NCSS last weekend, and I heard so many teachers say, I could never nominate myself. But I promise you, we want you to. It is really a favor to us to allow us to highlight your work and to show how our materials are getting into the classroom, which they can't without you all. And so, so it really would be doing us a favor to let us know all the great things you're doing with our materials in your classroom. And it also is not a super lengthy application. But please consider nominating yourself.
And if you can't fathom nominating yourself, and nominate someone else, they will get a trip to DC out of it. So it is well worth it if you want to recognize a colleague too.
Yeah, and if you want someone else to nominate you, just sort of like, just happen to email them, forward this to them, and then they'll get the hint. We don't give any weight to that, by the way, just in case you're wondering. There's no more consideration given to an application where someone else nominates you than when you nominate yourself. So stop being humble and nominate yourself. Okay, we already dropped this, I believe, in the chat. I accidentally actually dropped it early, so maybe Jen dropped it too. So please sign up for our newsletters. This is really how people find out about things like the pilot and find out that we're launching a new site. So please, please sign up if you're not already signed up. It's the best way to know when we're starting new things. And we very pretty frequently look for pilot teachers to test our materials, because Jen was in the classroom as a middle school teacher, and I was in the classroom as a high school teacher, but we're no longer in the classroom. We don't have our own laboratory, so we really rely on teachers to do that for us. Jen, any last words?
No.
Well, thank you all so much for coming. We know that you had a long day at the almost end of a week, so we really appreciate you spending an hour with us. Can't thank you enough. And we hope that we'll see some of your names in the applications for the pilot. I also dropped our email in there if you'd like to connect about that or anything else.
And the recording will be available. We will put it on the Legal Timelines website. We'll put it on our YouTube page. And if you're following our social media, you'll be able to see when it's ready then. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.